When I was a freshman in high school, I played soccer with practice running until 6 each night. Since my parents both worked evenings, I'd walk home from school. I had the house to myself until they got home, but after this particular night, I hated going home alone. As fall turned to winter, the walk home got darker, which was creepy as hell because we lived in the woods. The houses were set far off from the road down long, wooded dirt driveways. Along the main road, there were these short stone walls, a throwback from when people had sheep pastures and the low fences were enough to keep them in. Now the woods had taken over the pastures and the forest was reclaiming those stone ruins. Coming to and from our house, we had to cross a short bridge which covered a creek which led to the river. It was a narrow bridge, but seemed wider and brighter because the trees parted to the sky, even when the sun was setting. Despite that, I always looked down into the dark water. I was looking for the pale man. Since we'd first moved into the area, I'd heard stories of a creature that stalked the woods around us. There were so many stories of people seeing him, both in the woods and around the creek. The first time I heard about the pale man was from one of our neighbors, Ed. The winter we'd moved in, we had a particularly bad snowstorm for the area, and my dad, being kind, went over to check on old Ed, who lived alone. He welcomed us in, made coffee and small talk, happy for the company, I assume. Eventually, he asked us if we'd heard about the pale man, and at that point we hadn't and shook our heads. Ed settled into his chair. As a hunter, he recalled there used to be coyotes and foxes, all kinds of wildlife in our woods. But animal sightings became more and more rare over time. He said he used to fish in the creek, too, but even the fish disappeared. One early morning, just as the sun was about to rise, Ed was perched in his hunting blind when the woods suddenly went silent. He looked around, expecting to see a bear or some other predator, but it was much worse. About 100 yards away, at the edge of the creek bank, was a long-legged, pale creature. It was squatting in such a way, with its long bony legs angled above its drooping head, that he thought it was an enormous pale spider. Except it had a wide humanoid head. Where there should have been a face, there was only darkness, like it had been turned inward, a black void. He said he was so stunned, so confused by what he was seeing, that he didn't even realize he was looking at its face, and it was looking at him. In an instant, it turned and skittered back towards the creek, lengthening its long legs to reach the creek's edge. With trembling hands, he realized all this happened before he could even raise his rifle. My dad laughed off the story as we walked home, but after that day, he didn't let our little dog Jasper off leash in the backwoods anymore. From then on, I felt unsettled outside, like something was there in the woods just out of sight. I didn't want to believe something like that could be in our woods. But that was just the first of many stories we would hear about the pale man. He was something of a local legend around here. One foggy night, walking home after practice, Ed's story creeped back into my thoughts. I could feel my imagination kicking into overdrive with thoughts of the pale man, and I turned to look over my shoulder at the bridge with every sound, real or imagined. Of course, there was nothing there. The fog made it hard to see, but I felt ridiculous for scaring myself. With my driveway in sight, I heard leaves crunching in the darkness to my right, just behind the stone wall, and started running, fear getting the best of me. I raced down my dirt driveway and didn't look back until I was inside. Peering through the window by the door, I saw nothing but darkness. I kicked off my shoes and turned on all the lights, feeling better inside the safety of my house. I laughed to myself about how stupid I'd been to run away. I gave Jasper a good scratch behind the ears, and he looked up, then past me. A deep bark bellowed from his tiny old body, making me jump. I turned and caught something pale move past the kitchen window behind me towards the back of the house. Before I could think, I ran to the back door and pushed the curtain aside, flicking the switch to light the back porch. With the light barely touching the darkness beyond, I saw the pale man. I saw the outline of his head turn and look back, bloated, wet, pale skin surrounding a dark void of rotten flesh. His long, crooked, bent legs moved unnaturally fast, predator-like, stretching long and propelling him from the light into the darkness, just like a spider. And then he was gone. My parents sold that house after I graduated high school, and that was the only time I ever saw the pale man. But I know he's real. There are things that live out there on the edges that we can't explain. Believe me, I've tried. But they do exist. Be careful out there. My big brother Ben told me this story about a time he went urban exploring with his then new girlfriend, but now wife, Melanie. A little background on us: we grew up in a West Virginia mining town. You know, the kind you drive through and hope you don't break down. By the time we were in high school, mining was drying up and people moved out of the area pretty fast, leaving behind hollowed out, boarded up buildings. Sometimes it felt like whole towns were just deserted. There wasn't much to do except hang out and smoke, so that's what we did. A night spent checking out an empty, abandoned building was better than sitting home, because you never knew what you could find, and these places were creepy as hell. This is Ben's story. I asked Melanie if she wanted to check out the row of buildings leading out of Summitville, a couple of towns over from ours. It had been a pass-through town at best, but was now in the abandoned middle of nowhere. The only people left in the area were a few old-timers and meth-head squatters with nowhere else to go. Our friend Mark had checked out the post office and said it was worth exploring. But Mark was nuts. He was the kind of guy who would get fearless drunk and jump off the Falls River Bridge at night. I thought it would be cool to check out the old building and look brave to Melanie, and since Mark had just cleared it, Melanie was down. She liked exploring as much as I did. At the end of a row of connected buildings was an old storefront where the glass had been smashed. Climbing through the hole, we could see there was nothing left of the ceiling but a few moldy, hanging tiles where the rain could get in. In the moonlight, we could see broken glass everywhere, and everything smelled of piss. The ground was covered in muck and black water. At the far end of the store, there was a short wood-paneled hallway that led to the post office. The roof was still standing in this small space, and there was a stack of wet cardboard and some dirty blankets on the ground, like someone had been sleeping there. Melanie was instantly on edge about going further, worried we might run into some crackhead squatting there. I told her we were fine because Mark had just been through the row of buildings and hadn't run into anybody. Knowing Mark, I don't think that made her feel any better. She stayed behind me as I pushed through the door at the far end of this hallway into the post office. As our eyes adjusted to the darkness, we could see the old 60s-style post office was a crumbling mess, like something out of a horror movie. It was mostly intact, with rows of post office boxes lining one wall, their doors gaping open like missing teeth. There were 2 dark hallways leading towards the back of the building. The entire front of the building had been glass at one point, now long broken, covered with moldy wooden boards. The voids between the boards let enough moonlight sneak through to see the dark muck and paper strewn all over the floor. There was a strong, nauseating smell of mildew and urine. Melanie kept stopping me as we looked around, grabbing my arm, saying she heard weird noises. I didn't hear anything at first since I was in front slopping through the muck. But when I did stop, I heard something move behind us. I brushed it off, thinking it was rats or something. But then things got intense. We were at the far end of the front room, past the second hallway leading to the back, when we heard a crashing sound at the far end of the first hallway, the one that was between us and our exit. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt this sense of dread creep over me. Whatever had made that sound was big. It was no rat. Suddenly, we saw this creature darting between the shadows. It was huge, like a massive dog, but something about it just wasn't right. It moved faster than something that size should move, slinking low to the ground. We ducked down behind the farthest corner to see it better, but it stayed in the shadows. At first, I thought it was avoiding us like animals do until I locked eyes with it. Eyes that were an eerie shade of yellow and didn't shine in the moonlight like a dog's. They just glowed. When it lunged towards us, Melanie screamed and pulled me backwards deeper into the hallway. That's when we ran hard into something like a desk or a table, and I felt her hand drop away from my arm. We got separated in the darkness. I could hear her screams echoing through the hall, but I couldn't see her. I felt like things were moving all around me. The echoes of her screams bounced around the dark, musty building. I had my arms out, trying to feel for the walls, and pressed against the row of post office boxes, bracing to steady myself in the darkness pressing in all around me. I yanked my arms back when I felt coarse, dirty hair over muscle as something bumped me. Finally, it was quiet. In the silence, I just hoped Melanie had gotten past it. Then it was just me and this thing. I could hear it behind me now, stalking me through the darkness. My heart was pounding like crazy, and I tried to hold in my screams, but I couldn't. I felt like this thing was in every shadow, hiding and waiting for me to get close so it could pounce. I slid along the wall towards the exit. By some miracle, I splashed into the black water in the old store, through the broken glass we'd come through, and saw Melanie outside. She screamed for me to run and took off ahead of me towards where we parked. Without looking back, I raced to the car, feeling like something was going to pull me back into that old, rotten building. Peeling out, we looked back towards the row of buildings, but saw nothing. Just an empty, broken building. When we told our friends about what happened, nobody believed us. They kept exploring buildings like this for years, but never mentioned seeing anything like we did that night. All of them except for Mark. When I asked him why he didn't want to go, he said he just didn't feel like it anymore. I think he had his own experience he won't talk about. I know we weren't hallucinating, but I can't explain what we experienced that night, or why it didn't leave that old building to chase after us. Thinking about that night still gives me chills. I write for a well-known outdoor survivalist blog. We have this park ranger submission column where rangers can share their work stories, usually about safety or things they recommend. Our readers eat those stories up, but we had one submission that was repeatedly rejected. There was one former park ranger that kept bugging us to run his story about something he saw on the night he quit working in Colorado's Rocky Mountain National Park. The blog's editor would see his email and roll his eyes, saying the guy was nuts. But that only made me curious. Maybe there was a story there I could use. I was working on a cryptid book. When I called the ranger, this is the story he told me. I had an insane encounter while patrolling the park in early winter. We'd be getting reports of a massive bear hanging around a stretch of campgrounds. No big deal. That time of year, bears are getting the last of their fat stores to prep for hibernation, and sometimes they get pushy. But the reports on this bear were different. Not only did every complaint mention this bear was huge, it was also causing serious problems. This bear was following hikers for miles, appearing and then reappearing on the trail. Classic stalking type behavior. We also found signs of it trying to get into our locked structures and vehicles. Real destructive stuff, but we couldn't figure out why. There wasn't food stored in those buildings, so there wasn't a good reason why a bear would want to get in. We'd started suspecting we had a real problem bear on our hands. One that could become a man-eater. One night, when I was doing rounds, I saw it. Rounding a bend in the park road, I found this huge bear just standing there. But here's the thing. It's not just big, it's freaking enormous. Like twice the size of any black bear I'd ever seen. I thought it was a huge grizzly, it was so big. I slammed on my brakes, and this beast rears up on its hind legs, towering over my truck like some mythical creature. It stared right at me, and man, those eyes, they weren't animal eyes. They were evil. All black and sunken in. I felt like it was looking into my soul. We locked eyes for what felt like an eternity of terror, but was probably just a few seconds. As I'm staring at it, it starts to grow. Like by the foot, until I can't see its head from the headlights of my truck. Now, I know how this sounds. I'm not crazy, and I don't know that I'd believe me. Without warning, it charged straight at my truck, like it's got nothing to lose. I heard the crunch of metal as it slammed into the front end, and watched its dark fur shear clean off, revealing black, torn flesh hanging from bone. And I remember the smell. It wasn't the usual awful bear smell. It was putrid, like the smell of rotting death. Unfazed, it slammed against the truck again and bent to look at me. I see its horrible, massive head, furless, just black, rotting bear flesh and sunken black eyes spanning the entirety of my windshield. And then as suddenly as it rushed me, it turned towards the woods like something unseen had called it away. I felt the front end of the truck stabilize as the creature lurched off of it and disappeared into the darkness of the woods. I was just sitting there, shaking like a leaf, trying to process what the hell had just happened. That thing was no bear. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen. And the way it looked at me, looked through me, I'll never forget it. I know I cheated death in that moment, and I quit that very night. Over the course of the next 2 months, 3 people went missing in that park. And despite everyone saying I'm crazy, I know that undead thing, that monster, did something to them. Whatever it is, it's probably still hunting in those woods, and you couldn't pay me to ever go back in there.